Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And today's video was suggested by Moonlight Cocktail in the comments section beneath my video on the Roaring Girl, which I will leave linked in a card up here. In that video, I looked at the text we're going to be exploring today briefly, Hic Mulier and Haec Vir. I was referencing them for the way that they can help us to understand how the real-life Mary Frith inspired the fictional character of Moll Cutpurse in The Roaring Girl. However, these texts also have wider-reaching implications. Namely, they help us to explore and examine the particular and peculiar complexities surrounding the early modern English professional stage. These texts complain about an alleged practice of cross-dressing by some men and women in English society. So what might that mean in a more wider context for the all-male professional playing stages of early modern England, where female characters are being played by men? And what also might it tell us about a seeming fashion among Shakespeare and many of his contemporaries to have those female characters, who are played by men, then cross-dress themselves? What is it about the transvestite in English society and on the English stage that seems to be both frightening and compelling? Let's have a look at it. Let's begin by looking at the texts themselves. Here are the frontispieces for Hic Mulier and Haec Vir. These pamphlets were licensed for publication in February 1620. Hic Mulier came first on the 9th of February, and Haec Vir was second on the 16th. This latter text seems to have been intended as a reply or counter-argument to the former. The texts would both be sold at Christ Church Gate in London. And if any of you would like to have a look at either of these texts, I will leave a link to an online facsimile edition that contains both Hic Mulier and Haec Vir in the description box down below. The pamphlets were licensed for publication by John Trundle. He was known to be a seller of topical tracts. L.B. Wright asserts that the speed with which Haec Vir was made ready for publication suggests that, quote, the two were designed as a bookseller's effort to capitalise on the controversy over the position of women. And this controversy was certainly contemporary and evident. 5 years previously, in 1615, the arraignment of lewd, idle, forward and unconstant women was published. By 1620, there were 5 editions of this text. King James I of England and VI of Scotland weighed in himself in 1620, when he complained of, quote, the insolence of our women, and their wearing of broad-brimmed hats, pointed doublets, their hair cut short or shorn, and some of them stilettos or poniards. These were bladed weapons that could be worn at the belt or secreted elsewhere about the person. They were daggers. He goes on to complain of them wearing other trinkets of like moment. These debates and controversy and complaints were not a new thing. The ridiculing of masculine women, and effeminate men for that matter, has its roots in classical literature. And indeed, the prohibition against cross-dressing is biblical, as we find in Deuteronomy 22:5. The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment. For all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God. In William Harrison's description of England, which was published as part of Holinshed's Chronicles in both 1577 and 1587, he complains, quote, in women it is most to be lamented, that they do now far exceed the lightness of our men. And such staring attire as in time past was supposed meet for none but light housewives only, is become an habit for chaste and sober matrons. What should I say of their doublets with pendant codpieces on the breast, full of jags and cuts, and sleeves of sundry colours? Their galligaskins to bear out their bums, and make their attire to fit plumb round, as they term it, about them. Their farthingales and diversely coloured netherstocks of silk, jersey and such like, whereby their bodies are rather deformed than commended. I have met with some of these trolls in London, so disguised that it hath passed my skill to discern whether they were men or women. Thus it is now come to pass that women become men, and men transformed into monsters. These implications or allegations of immorality, viciousness, monstrosity and deformity in relation to cross-dressing has a long history, as I think I've shown. But it also appears in the pamphlets we're looking at today, Hic Mulier and Haec Vir. And to show that, I am going to be looking at portions from both of these texts. To do so, I'm going to use that online facsimile edition and show you those sections from that. As I mentioned earlier, I will be leaving a link to that facsimile edition in its online format in the description box down below. As Hic Mulier appeared first in 1620, I think it makes sense that we start there. The first section of text that I want to look at together is interesting for a couple of reasons. And before we dive into the excerpt itself, I want to point out that in this, the author is explicitly communicating with their female readership. And so this leads me to a couple of questions. What can we infer from this about female buying power, literacy, and the readership of women of these pamphlets? Can we assume that this author at least is expecting a statistically significant portion of their readership to be women? Is that why they have addressed it in this way? Women, good women, modest women, true women, ever young because ever virtuous, ever chaste, ever glorious, when I write of you, I will write with a golden pen on leaves of golden paper. Now I write with a rough quill and black ink on iron sheets, the iron deeds of an iron generation. Come then, you masculine women, for you are my subject, you that have made admiration an ass, and fooled him with a deformity never before dreamed of, that have made yourselves stranger things than ever Noah's ark unladed, or Nile engendered, whom to name, he that named all things might study an age to give you a right attribute, whose like are not found in any antiquary study, in any seaman's travel, nor in any painter's cunning. You that are stranger than strangeness itself, whom wise men wonder at, boys shout at, and goblins themselves start at. You that are the gilt dirt which embroiders playhouses, the painted statues which adorn crotches, and the perfumed carrion that bad men feed on in brothels. 'Tis of you I entreat, and of your monstrous deformity. See then that talk of monstrosity and deformity, and also its connection to the playhouses. I think that is particularly telling. Next up, I want to look at this section, where the author appears to be echoing the complaints of both William Harrison and also King James. From the other, you have taken the monstrousness of your deformity in apparel, exchanging the modest attire of the comely hood, caul, coif, handsome dress or kerchief, to the cloudy, ruffianly broad-brimmed hat and wanton feather, the modest upper parts of a concealing straight gown to the loose, lascivious civil embracement of a French doublet, being all unbuttoned to entice, all of one shape to hide deformity, and extreme short-waisted to give a most easy way to every luxurious action. The glory of a fair large hair to the shame of a most ruffianly short locks, the side thick gathered and close guarding safeguards to short, weak, thinned, loose, and every hand entertaining short bases, for needles, swords, for prayer books, bawdy legs, for modest gestures, giant-like behaviours, and for women's modesty, all mimic and apish incivility. These are your founders. From these you took your copies, and without amendment, with these you shall come to perdition. As the author approaches their conclusion, they offer a warning to husbands and fathers, saying the following: To you, therefore, that are fathers, husbands, or sustainers of these new hermaphrodites, belongs the cure of this imposthume. It is you that give fuel to the flames of their wild indiscretion. You add the oil which makes their stinking lamps defile the whole house with filthy smoke. And your purses purchase these deformities at rates both dear and unreasonable. Do you but hold close your liberal hands, or take a strict account of the employment of the treasure you give to their necessary maintenance, and these excesses will either cease, or else die smothered in prison in the tailors' trunks for want of redemption. The author finishes with a rebuke for the females they have been addressing. Quote, And therefore, to knit up this imperfect declamation, let every female masculine that by her ill example is guilty of lust or imitation, cast off her deformities, and clothe herself in the rich garments which the poet bestows upon her in these verses following. Those virtues that in women merit praise are sober shows without, chaste thoughts within, true faith and due obedience to their mate, and of their children honest care to take. So as I'm sure we're all aware, and if nothing else, the title for this video is no doubt a bit of a clue, the conclusion of Hic Mulier does not represent the end of this particular phase of the debate or discussion in February 1620. Rather, within days, another text has been prepared for publication. This one, Haec Vir. Experts in the field have analysed both of these pamphlets, and they have come to the conclusion that they are by different authors. There is sufficient stylistic and writing differences to make this clear to them. Unlike the text Hic Mulier, Haec Vir is written as a dialogue. Haec Vir, the womanish man, encounters Hic Mulier, the mannish woman, on a street. He takes her for a man and a knight, while she takes him for another woman who is mocking her. The debate begins. Despite the fact that these are written by different authors, there is something that remains the same across both texts, and it will be clear as we go through the sections. A recurrent theme of an argument of immorality, viciousness, deformity and monstrosity when it comes to cross-dressing will be evident here as well. The first few interactions of this dialogue show Haec Vir and Hic Mulier asserting their true sex identity. It seems that when Haec Vir realises that he is the only man in this interaction, that it is now his job to educate the wayward female before him. He asserts the following: Then thus, in that book you are arraigned and found guilty, first, of baseness, in making yourself a slave to novelty, and the poor invention of every weak brain that hath but an embroidered outside. Next, of unnaturalness, to forsake the creation of God and customs of the kingdom, to be pieced and patched up by a French tailor, an Italian baby maker, and a Dutch soldier beat from the army for the ill example of ruffianly behaviour. Then of shamefulness, in casting off all modest softness and civility, to run through every desert and wilderness of men's opinions like careless untamed heifers or wild savages. Lastly, of foolishness, in having no moderation or temper either in passions or affections, but turning all into perturbations and sickness of the soul. Laugh away the preciousness of your time, and at last die with the flattering sweet malice of an incurable consumption. Thus, baseness, unnaturalness, shamefulness, foolishness are the main hatchments or coat armours which you have taken as rich spoils to adorn you in the deformity of your apparel. The lady, Hic Mulier, set about refuting Haec Vir's complaints about her behaviour, dress, and alleged immorality, monstrosity, viciousness, and deformity. He, on the other hand, in response to her seemingly first defence of herself, appears to double down. He gives her the following warning. To conclude, if you will walk without difference, you shall live without reverence. If you will contemn order, you must endure the shame of disorder. And if you will have no rulers but your wills, you must have no reward but disdain and disgrace. After some further back and forth, this pamphlet dialogue seems to result in the at least partial reformation of both figures by its end. The lady Hic Mulier acknowledges that the man Haec Vir has gone some way to alter her way of viewing things, and potentially of her way of behaving in the future. Nevertheless, she is still determined to conclude with her own recommendations for how Haec Vir should behave in future. There is a running theme in her argument. If Haec Vir and the other men of society feel that it is their right to position themselves above women, to dictate how they should behave and dress, then surely they should be held to an even higher standard of behaviour than women are. How is it that women should know how to behave and dress in the appropriate feminine fashion when there are men, like Haec Vir, who effeminate themselves and walk about town? The final part of their interaction in this dialogue reads as follows. Hic Mulier commands Haec Vir to, quote, "Cast them from you our ornaments, and put on your own armour. Be men in shape, men in show, men in words, men in actions, men in counsel, men in example. Then will we love and serve you. Then will we hear and obey you. Then will we, like rich jewels, hang at your ears to take our instructions. Like true friends, follow you through all dangers. And like careful leeches, pour oil into your wounds. Then shall you find delight in our words, pleasure in our faces, faith in our hearts, chastity in our thoughts, and sweetness, both in our inward and outward inclinations. Comeliness shall be then our study, fear our armour, and modesty our practice. Then shall we be all your most excellent thoughts can desire, and having nothing in us less than impudence and deformity." Haec Vir, for his part, seems to capitulate, saying, "Enough! You have both raised mine eyelids, cleared my sight, and made my heart entertain both shame and delight in an instant. Shame in my follies past, delight in our noble and worthy conversation. Away then from me these light vanities, the only ensigns of a weak and soft nature. And come you grave and solid pieces which arm a man with fortitude and resolution. You are too rough and stubborn for a woman's wearing. We will here change our attires as we have changed our minds, and with our attires our names. I will no more be Haec Vir, but Hic Vir, nor you Hic Mulier, but Haec Mulier. From henceforth deformity shall pack to hell, and if at any time he hide himself upon the earth, yet it shall be with contempt and disgrace. He shall have no friend but poverty, no favourer but folly, nor no reward but shame. Henceforth we will live nobly like ourselves, ever sober, ever discreet, ever worthy, true men and true women. We will be henceforth like well-coupled doves, full of industry, full of love. I mean not of sensual and carnal love, but heavenly and divine love, which proceeds from God, whose inexpressible nature none is able to deliver into words, since it is like his dwelling, high and beyond the reach of human apprehension, according to the saying of the poem in these verses following. Of love's perfection perfectly to speak, or of his nature rightly to define, indeed doth far suppress our reason's reach, and needs his priest to express his power divine. For long before the world was he born, and bred above its highest celestial sphere, for by his power the world was made of yore, and all that therein wondrous doth appear. Thus the pamphlet Haec Vir concludes with a call that people respect the divine order. But what does that mean, and how was it imagined in early modern England? Perhaps for a good example we can look to this image from 1579. It shows the great chain of being, the divine plan for all of creation, putting everything and everyone in its rightful place. God has designed creation and put these things in their place from their very origin. So potentially, arguably, from birth, your place in the world is set. Angels sit above man. Man sits above the animals and plants. Kings and princes are born to sit above nobles, nobles above the commons, and men above women. This belief that it is the divine will, part of the divine order, that there be a stratified society, highborn above lowborn, men above women, finds its expression in the legal form of the sumptuary law, shown here. The sumptuary laws were legal controls on the consumption of luxuries, and it was dependent upon a person's social position. Certain things were only eligible and available to people of certain classes. Thus, arguably, if a woman should cross-dress as a man, she is attempting to elevate herself in both a sumptuary but also a spiritual context. She is going against the chain of being and also her society's legal prohibitions. Similarly, if a man should act in the opposite fashion and dress in feminine clothing, he is also subverting things. Because while sumptuary law bans people from wearing things above their station, I believe that implied within that is that class comes with a uniform. There is an expectation that if you are of a higher social order, you will be able to afford and dress in a style that displays that to all around. So when a man adopts female attire, he is not only going against God and the great chain of being, he is also subverting sumptuary law, albeit in a different way. However, the difference between men and women as it was perceived in early modern England and, for that matter, in Europe, is not simply spiritual and legal, it's also scientific, biological. The early modern understanding of the way in which the body worked, the notion of the four humours, is something that I've made a video on and I will leave linked in a card up here. Here is an image of how the four humours were understood in the period. From their mothers' wombs, men and women were not created equal. There was a belief that men, humorally, were hot and dry, and, because of that, the more perfect example of human creation. Women, on the other hand, were created because they were improperly heated in their mothers' wombs, and so they emerged cold and wet. Their bodies, the inversion of men, the imperfect form of humanity. Not only were they physically frailer, but they were also believed to be mentally and morally frailer, because of this humoral imbalance implicit within them from birth. They would have to eat foods to try to avoid further cooling and wetting themselves. Similarly, men would have to avoid things that would heat them up further, make them more angry. But, of course, it is perhaps better to be martial than to be hysterical. Better to be sanguine than melancholic. And so there is a hierarchy of humoral imbalance which sees men once again being placed above women. Women's frailty, both physically, mentally and morally, in a humoral, legal and spiritual context means that men are naturally being placed above them. However, another belief within humoral science is that the human body is both porous and mutable. The skin is not a barrier. It can be leaky. It can allow things to make their way in. Things like miasma or bad air can get in through the skin and make a person sick in mind, body or soul. So if the skin behaves in this way and bodies can be mutated and changed because of things they come into contact with, what might that mean if somebody puts on to their skin the attire of a rank that is not their own, whether too high or too low, according to either the great chain of being or sumptuary law? If a man puts on female attire, if a noble dresses as a commoner, does this, their porous skin and mutable body, have the capacity to be changed by it, infected by it? And thus, could such a behaviour cause damage or danger for the health of their mind, body or soul? Let me know what you think about that in the comments section down below. Within this construction of danger, that is spiritual, legal and medical, I think there are wide-reaching implications for the men of the early modern professional playhouses in England, and also for their audiences. Let's look at this text by Stephen Gosson. It is the School of Abuse from 1579. Gosson describes the theatre as having the capacity to, quote, effeminate the mind as pricks unto vice, end quote. And as such, it, quote, was the first cup that poisoned the Commonwealth, end quote. If cross-dressing flies in the face of the divine order, risks transmuting the body and threatens to lead a person into vice and lust, what does that mean for the males of the early modern professional playhouse in England who played the woman's part? What does an audience member see or find appealing in the male-acted female characters? As an example, let's think about the character of Rosalind in As You Like It and the performer's effect on the men and women in the audience of the Globe. Did this actor incite lust? And if so, for who or for what? And what does this mean? Were audiences willing to suspend their disbelief and no longer see the male beneath the female character? So, if men fell in love, was it with the boy actor or the character being portrayed? The same question goes for females in the audience. What happens, as in the case of Rosalind, when that character then disguises themselves in male attire? When the female character essentially is stripped away to show the boy or male player underneath? For an added layer, as in the case of Rosalind, this male player, who is Rosalind, disguises herself as the male servant Ganymede, who then, in turn, performs the part of Rosalind for her lover Orlando's benefit. What on earth is Shakespeare intending to elicit in his audience with this, whether they are male or female, high or low born? In this player and the characters being portrayed by them, are they seeing a Haec Vir or a Hic Mulier? Are they stirred to lust? And in this performance, is the actor risking his own spiritual, legal and humoral position? So what took place there was an impromptu rapid-fire question session. I'm also aware that I have peppered questions throughout this video. If there's anything you'd like to add, if you have a suggestion for another topic that you'd like me to cover, or if you'd like to provide an answer to any or all of those questions, then please feel free to do so in the comment section below. Or you can come and find me over on my social media. As always, I will leave the links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box. Follow me there and we can continue this conversation. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to the channel, and while you're there, why not hit the little notification bell that sits next to the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Do take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.